There's a kind of boy every school overlooks. Quiet, careful, always in the back row, never asking for attention. Elijah Carter was that boy, a scholarship student at a school that had never quite made room for him, and Principal Whitmore thought he'd found the perfect way to remind everyone of that. Put him on a stage, in front of 600 students, at a piano no one had ever seen him touch, and let the silence do the rest. What Whitmore didn't know was what those quiet hands were actually capable of, and who had spent years putting it there. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The thing about Elijah Carter was that he had mastered the art of disappearing. Not literally, of course, but in the way that mattered most at Hargrove Academy, where the hallways smelled like polished oak and entitlement, where blazers had crests stitched above the chest pocket, and where every student seemed to carry themselves like the world already belonged to them, Elijah had figured out how to take up as little space as possible. He sat in the back row. He kept his blazer buttoned all the way up. He never raised his hand first, even when he knew the answer. He ate lunch at the corner table by the window that faced the parking lot rather than the courtyard, where everyone else gathered in clusters of noise and laughter. He was 13 years old, the only kid at Hargrove on a full academic scholarship from the city's youth enrichment program, and he had been here 8 months. 8 months of learning the rules without anyone explaining them. 8 months of figuring out which hallways to avoid, which teachers called on you because they expected you to fail, and which ones just forgot you were there. Both were fine by him. Both meant he could keep his head down and get through the day. That Tuesday morning started the same way every Tuesday started. Elijah walked through the front entrance with his backpack on both shoulders, which some of the older boys had once teased him about, said it looked like he was going hiking. But they'd stopped eventually when he didn't react, and he made his way to room 114, Mr. Pearson's language arts class, 4 minutes before the bell. He sat down, unzipped his bag, and pulled out his notebook. To anyone glancing over, it looked like a standard composition notebook. The black and white marbled kind you could get for $1 at a pharmacy. But if you opened it, you'd find almost no written words at all. Instead, page after page was filled with music, staff lines drawn by hand with a ruler, notes scribbled in pencil, sometimes crossed out, sometimes layered on top of each other, chords mapped out in small grids along the margins. A time signature changed 3 times on one page before he'd settled on something. It wasn't assignment work. It wasn't doodling exactly. It was something he did the way some people breathe, without deciding to, without thinking about it. He was deep into a passage he'd been working on for 3 days when the classroom door banged open and 2 boys came in loud, the way boys who didn't have to worry about being noticed always came in. Elijah capped his pen and flipped the notebook shut. Not quickly, not obviously, just quietly. It was a reflex. Room 114 had a keyboard along the back wall, an old Roland, the kind with slightly stiff keys and a pitch bend wheel that stuck when the weather changed. It had been there since before Elijah arrived, pushed against the wall beside a shelf of dusty encyclopedias, and as far as he could tell, Mr. Pearson only used it during poetry units when he occasionally played something soft in the background to set the mood. It sat unused most of the time. That morning, Elijah noticed during his free read period that one of the keys was stuck, the F above middle C, producing a faint, constant buzz even when nothing was being pressed. He recognized the sound immediately. He'd heard it before, knew exactly what caused it. A piece of debris. Sometimes a broken spring, but usually something wedged under the key, an eraser crumb, a corner of paper, even a broken fingernail. He'd fixed the same problem on his keyboard at home 4 times. He waited until Mr. Pearson stepped into the hallway to speak with another teacher. Then he slid out of his seat, walked to the back of the room, and gently pressed the key. He lifted it from the underside the way he'd been shown, carefully angling a pencil into the gap to clear whatever was lodged there. 30 seconds, maybe less. He was back in his seat before anyone really registered he'd moved. But Cameron Briggs had seen him. Cameron, who sat 2 rows over and who had a habit of performing commentary on everything that happened around him, loud enough for the nearest cluster of students to hear. Cameron, who wasn't mean exactly, but who enjoyed the performance of being noticed. "Yo, Elijah was messing with the keyboard," he said, to no one and everyone at once. Mr. Pearson came back in at that exact moment. Elijah looked up and started to explain. He hadn't been messing with anything. The F key had been stuck. But Mr. Pearson was already walking toward the Roland with a look on his face that Elijah recognized, the look of a man who didn't want a complication added to his already full day. He pressed a few keys. The keyboard worked. He turned around. "Elijah, I'd prefer you didn't touch equipment that isn't yours." "The key was stuck," Elijah said. He kept his voice flat and steady. "I fixed it." "I'm sure you meant well," Mr. Pearson said, in a tone that made clear he wasn't sure of that at all. "But please leave the instruments alone going forward." Elijah nodded and said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. He should have left it there. And in a way, he did. He went back to his notebook. He sat through the rest of class. He didn't speak again. But the school operated on its own particular kind of telephone, that private academy version where information traveled fast and always landed hardest on whoever could afford it least. By second period, he'd heard his own name twice in conversations he wasn't part of. By lunch, he knew it had gotten back to someone in the main office. He found out the rest at the end of the school day. Principal Harold Whitmore's name appeared on the school's website above a black and white photo of a man in a dark suit who looked like he'd never once been surprised by anything. When he had the kind of face that expressed everything through the space between his eyebrows, the slight pinch of them when he was displeased, the deliberate smoothing of them when he wanted to appear neutral. He'd been at Hargrove for 11 years. Every parent who mentioned him used words like standards and discipline and results. What they were really saying was that Whitmore kept the school looking like what they'd paid for it to look like. He ran assemblies the way generals ran briefings, tightly, efficiently, with the implicit message that your presence was a privilege being extended rather than a right being honored. He gave speeches about excellence and character that used the word "we" to mean the institution, not the students. He had the particular talent of making every public correction of a student feel educational, like something being done for the student's benefit, while everyone watching knew it was something being done for his own. Elijah was called to the office during the last 20 minutes of his final class. He sat across from Principal Whitmore in a chair that was positioned just slightly lower than the one behind the desk. Elijah had noticed that before, on the one other time he'd been in this office for an orientation meeting in September. He didn't know if it was intentional. He suspected it was. Whitmore let him sit in silence for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Carter," he folded his hands on the desk. "Do you know why you're here?" "I think so," Elijah said. "The keyboard in room 114 is school property." "Well, you tampered with it." "I fixed a stuck key," Elijah said. "The F above middle C was producing a buzz. I cleared the obstruction." Whitmore tilted his head slightly. "And you know how to do that?" "Yes." There was a pause. Something shifted in Whitmore's expression, not softened exactly, but recalibrated. "Elijah, I don't doubt that your intentions were good, but there is a process. School equipment is maintained by our facilities staff. Students do not handle instruments, computers, or any school property without authorization. Is that understood?" "Yes." "The issue," Whitmore said, drawing out the word slightly, "is that this isn't simply about the keyboard. It's about the kind of student you're choosing to be at this school. Hargrove has a reputation, one that took decades to build. Every student here is a reflection of that." Elijah listened. He had learned over 8 months that what was required in these moments was stillness. Not submission exactly, but the strategic offering of silence, which adults in authority almost always interpreted as acceptance. "I've decided," Whitmore said, "that a private conversation isn't sufficient here. Actions that involve school property and disrupt the classroom need to be addressed in a way the whole school community can learn from." Elijah looked at him. "Tomorrow morning, during the all-school assembly, you'll be asked to address what you did. We have a piano in the gym. Since you're clearly so interested in our instruments—" A small, deliberate pause. "You'll have the opportunity to demonstrate what you know." Elijah's throat tightened, not visibly, but it tightened. "You want me to perform," he said. "I want you to stand in front of your peers and take accountability," Whitmore said. "If you can play, play. If you can't, then perhaps this is a lesson learned." There it was, the whole architecture of it, clean and ugly at the same time. Whitmore didn't know whether Elijah could play or not. He didn't care. Either outcome worked. Either Elijah fumbled in front of the whole school, in which case the image of a scholarship kid out of his depth stuck. Or Elijah refused, which could be framed as defiance. The performance wasn't the point. The exposure was. Elijah nodded. He picked up his bag. He walked out. The hallways after school had a particular quality of sound, looser, layered, voices bouncing off the marble floors, and Elijah moved through them the way he always did, not rushing, but not lingering. While he caught pieces of conversation as he passed, someone already knew. Of course, someone already knew. "Whitmore's making that scholarship kid play piano tomorrow." "He doesn't even play piano, does he?" "That's kind of the point, I think." Laughter. Elijah didn't slow down. Ms. Alvarez was standing near the music room doorway as he passed, a stack of folders tucked under one arm. She had the look of someone who'd been standing there deliberately rather than coincidentally. She was the school's music teacher, early 30s, quietly intense, the kind of person who heard everything without seeming to be listening. She met his eyes for a moment. Her mouth opened like she was going to say something. Then her jaw closed again. She looked down at her folders. Elijah kept walking. He didn't blame her. He understood the calculus. She had a job, a department to run, a paycheck. Getting between a student and the principal, especially over something as intangible as fairness, wasn't a battle that came with backup. He had no reason to expect anything from her. He expected nothing from anyone at this school, which was the cleanest way he'd found to survive it. He took the bus home, sat by the window, and watched the city change as it moved away from the academy's neighborhood and back into his own. The buildings got smaller and closer together. The streets got busier with people who moved differently, purposefully, practically, without the performance of ease. His mother was on a 12-hour shift. She worked nights this week. The apartment was quiet when he got home, the way it was quiet most afternoons. Not empty exactly. Because his grandmother's things were still on the shelves, even though she'd been gone 2 years, because the kitchen still smelled like the candles his mother burned, because the walls held sound somehow, but solitary. He dropped his bag on the kitchen table and stood in the hallway outside his bedroom for a moment. The door was open. His room was small but organized in the specific way of a person who used every inch intentionally. Books stacked by height on the shelf, clothes folded, a poster on the wall of John Coltrane, half his face in shadow, saxophone in hand, that he'd found at a thrift store and that his mother had helped him frame with cardboard and tape when they couldn't afford a real frame. And against the far wall, under the window, the keyboard. It was an old Casio, ivory-colored once, but now the shade of old teeth. It with keys that had been repaired so many times they wore it plainly. Tape over 2 cracked keys on the upper register. Handwritten labels on 3 of the lower ones that had lost their markings. Small pieces of white electrical tape with letters drawn in permanent marker. A sustain pedal connected by a cord that had been resoldered at the jack. The whole thing sat on a metal stand from a garage sale, adjusted with a folded piece of cardboard under one leg to keep it level. It was the most important object Elijah owned. He sat down on the edge of his bed and looked at it. Not playing it, just looking. His phone buzzed. His mother. How was school? He typed back, "Fine, tired, a lie." Not a complicated one, just the kind that kept the night from getting harder than it needed to be. She would be on her feet for another 6 hours. She didn't need this tonight. He lay back on his bed and stared at the ceiling. There was a memory that lived in his hands more than in his head. The feel of larger hands over his, patient and deliberate, pressing down on keys with a weight that was never force, but always intention. A voice saying, "Listen before you play, Eli. The music already exists. Your job is just to find it." The smell of coffee and cedar. A window with old curtains that moved in a way that meant the screen had a tear in it. He didn't let himself go all the way into the memory. He never did. It was like a room he could stand at the doorway of but not walk into without the grief catching up to him. He sat up after a while. He walked to the keyboard. He sat down on the stool. He pressed a single key, middle C, held it until it faded. He looked at his hands. He'd the hands that Whitmore wanted to use as a prop tomorrow. The hands that would either fumble in front of 600 students or... He exhaled slowly. "Don't mess this up." The words came out quiet, almost involuntary. But there was something underneath them that wasn't exactly fear. It was closer to the feeling before you walk into a room knowing you're the only one in it who knows what's in there. Something that had no name, exactly. Only weight. He sat with it for a long time in the quiet apartment, the glow of the street coming through the window, his hands resting still on the keys. The assembly was scheduled for 8:45, which meant the gym filled up between 8:30 and 8:40 as students moved in from first period. Hargrove's gym was large, real hardwood floors, bleachers that pulled out in 3 tiers. A stage at the far end used for performances and formal announcements. On days when the whole school was gathered, it held close to 600 people. The piano was already there when the students arrived. An upright Yamaha, black, positioned near the center front of the stage, lit up. Someone had set it there deliberately. That was clear. It wasn't where the piano usually lived. It was normally against the wall to the right of the stage, and the fact of it being moved, being centered, being visible from every seat in the gym, told its own story before anyone said a word. Students filed in. The bleachers filled in the way they always filled, by social gravity. Certain groups claiming the same rows they always claimed, certain people moving to be seen, and others moving to disappear. Phones came out. The noise level rose and then plateaued at that particular frequency that meant everyone was waiting for something to happen. Elijah came in with his class, which meant he came in with people who kept their distance from him in the specific way of people who don't dislike you but don't want to be adjacent to whatever is about to happen to you. He walked to a spot near the end of a bleacher row. He sat down. He set his hands on his knees. He looked at the piano. He had not slept much. But that wasn't unusual, and the feeling in his chest this morning was not quite what he'd expected when he'd imagined this moment last night. He'd expected something closer to dread. What was actually there was quieter than that, more compressed, like something waiting. The teacher standing near the stage door said something to someone. A few students looked toward the stage. Then Principal Whitmore walked out, and the noise dropped into that automatic near silence that authority produced in a room of adolescents who'd been conditioned by years of being in institutions. Whitmore stood at the microphone. He was in his standard uniform, dark suit, school tie, with the Hargrove crest, expression calibrated to convey both authority and benevolence simultaneously. The face of a man who believed he was always doing what was best for everyone, especially when he wasn't. "Good morning," he said. The room returned it in that scattered, overlapping way of assembled teenagers. "Before we begin today's announcements, I want to address something that came to my attention yesterday." He paused in the way of someone who had rehearsed the pause. "At Hargrove, we hold ourselves to a standard of conduct that goes beyond academic performance. That includes how we treat shared spaces, shared equipment, and the trust placed in us by this community." A beat. Eyes moved around the room, some already knowing where this was going. One of our students made a choice yesterday that I want us all to learn from. Elijah Carter. Whitmore's eyes moved to find him in the bleachers, found him, held briefly. "We'll come up to the stage." The bleachers shifted in that specific way they shift when something is happening, a collective repositioning, an alignment of attention toward a single point. Elijah stood. He moved along the row, stepped down from the bleacher, and walked across the gym floor toward the stage. The walk was roughly 40 feet. It was the kind of walk where every footstep sounds louder than it should, where you are aware of the exact temperature of your own face, where 600 people's attention is a physical thing pressing at the sides of you. He climbed the 3 steps onto the stage. He stood beside the piano, facing the room. Whitmore spoke without looking at him directly, addressing the assembly. Elijah decided, without permission, to handle school equipment in a way that was not authorized. As a learning community, we believe in accountability, and that accountability is most meaningful when it's public. He turned, finally, and gestured toward the piano. Elijah has apparently taken an interest in our instruments, so this morning he'll have the opportunity to share what he knows. There was laughter. Not everyone, maybe 30 or 40 students, but it was the kind of laughter that fills a space fast. It came from people who understood exactly what was happening, the kind of laughter that functions as a wall. Elijah didn't look at the laughing section, he looked at the piano. Somewhere in the 3rd row of the bleachers, a phone came up, then another one. Within 30 seconds, at least a dozen students had their phones angled at the stage. The recording had started before anything had happened. That was its own kind of editorial. He sat down on the bench. There was a pocket of silence, expectant but not generous. The kind of silence that is really just held breath before a reaction. He set his fingers on the keys. He pressed one note, middle C, held it. It rang out into the gym and then faded. Someone in the bleachers made a sound. Or not quite a laugh, something shorter and more dismissive. The message being communicated was clear. One note, that's it. There was a ripple of that same noise moving through the rows. Elijah adjusted his posture. It was subtle. He brought his back straighter, dropped his shoulders down and back, settled his forearms so they were parallel to the floor. It was the posture of someone preparing, not someone performing. The difference was real, even if no one watching it could have named what had changed. Then he began to play. Not a single note this time, not an easy scale to warm up. He went directly into the opening passage of a Chopin nocturne, the one in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2, and he played it with the kind of technical control that takes years to build. The kind that isn't about flashiness, it's about economy. Every note sitting exactly where it belongs. The left hand building the harmonic foundation with a rolling precision, while the right moved through the melody with a lightness that seemed like it shouldn't be possible from the same person, the same hands. The snickering stopped, not because anyone made it stop, because of what the piano was doing to the air. It happened in sections. First, the students nearest the stage, who could hear it most clearly, could feel the resonance through the floor, stopped what they were doing. Then the sound traveled back through the bleachers, and the students farther away caught it, and they stopped too. And then the whole room was in a kind of arrested state, like something had reached into the collective noise and switched it off. Phones were still up, but no one was commentating anymore. No one was nudging their friend. The phones had become something else, not instruments of mockery, but of witnessing. Elijah played through the first movement of the nocturne with complete fluency. His eyes were open, but not focused on anything in the room. Focused somewhere slightly beyond it, the way musicians sometimes look when the technical execution has become automatic enough that the attention can go somewhere deeper. The melody moved the way it was written to move, like something being remembered, not performed. like a feeling being traced. In the third row, Ms. Alvarez sat with her folder open on her lap, but she had stopped pretending to look at it. She was watching his hands. Her expression had moved through several things in the space of about 90 seconds. Surprise, then recognition, then something more complicated. She had a music education. She had studied for 7 years. She knew what she was hearing. The technique was not that of someone self-taught by YouTube. The voicing, the shaping of phrases, the understanding of dynamics. This was someone who had been trained seriously and carefully over a long period of time. Her eyes were wet before she was aware they had gotten that way. At the far right of the stage, slightly behind the microphone stand, Principal Whitmore stood with his hands clasped in front of him. He had begun this assembly with a specific vision of how it would go. He had imagined Elijah sitting down at the piano and producing something small and uncertain, or perhaps refusing entirely, or perhaps a few halting notes that would serve as the object lesson he'd intended. He had not, could not have, imagined this. His face had not changed, technically. All the same features were in the same positions, but the confidence that animated them was gone. In its place was something the expression wasn't designed to hold, the beginning of understanding that he had made an error of profound scale. Elijah continued playing. He moved through the nocturne and into a transition that wasn't Chopin anymore. It was something else, something that shifted the harmonic center slightly and let more air into the music, let it breathe differently. Not improvisation yet, still composed, but the piece he was playing had developed a second room, and he was walking into it. The bleachers were completely still. 600 adolescents, people who existed in a near constant state of performance for each other, who filtered every moment through the lens of how it looked and how it landed, had collectively forgotten to do that. They were just listening, not because they were supposed to, not because a teacher had asked them to, because something was happening in this gym that didn't happen here, and some part of them understood it without being able to articulate it. A girl in the upper bleachers had her hand over her mouth. She wasn't sure why. She hadn't decided to put it there. 2 boys in the lower row had straightened up from the slumped posture they'd walked in with and were leaning forward slightly, elbows on knees, watching Elijah's hands move. The phone recordings were still running, but their purpose had completely transformed. Elijah played through the end of the passage. His hands moved through the final phrase with the same care they'd given the first. No flagging, no showing off, just the exact amount of expression the music asked for. The last notes rang out across the gym and faded slowly into the hardwood and the bleachers and the walls. Silence. Actual silence, which is different from quiet. Quiet is the absence of noise. Silence is when noise recognizes it doesn't belong. It lasted several seconds, long enough to mean something. Then, one clap started. Singular, deliberate, from somewhere in the middle of the bleachers. Then, another. Then it spread, not explosively, not immediately, but with the momentum of something real, moving outward from the center until the whole gym was inside it. Students who would not have been able to explain what had happened to them were on their feet. And they were applauding, and the sound filled the gym in a way that Hargrove's gym had probably never been filled before. Elijah stood from the bench. He looked out at the room for a moment, a single, unreadable look that took in the standing students, the clapping, the phone still recording, the faces that had been ready to laugh at him 20 minutes ago and were now doing this other thing. He didn't smile. He reached down and lowered the piano lid, carefully, until the keys were covered. Then he walked off the stage, down the 3 steps, and back across the gym floor. Students near the aisle moved slightly without thinking about it, not to block his path, not to try to speak to him, just the physical acknowledgement of someone's presence that the body performs when the mind hasn't caught up yet. Elijah walked to his spot on the bleachers. He sat down, he set his hands on his knees, and if anyone had been looking at his face carefully and a few people were now, they would have seen that his jaw was set in the way of someone who has just done a hard thing and is still holding what it cost them. Not triumph, not relief, just a 13-year-old boy who had put something that was his into a room full of people who had gathered to watch him fail, and had held on to it anyway. By the time Elijah got home that afternoon, the video had already been watched by people in 4 different states. He didn't know that yet. He came home the same way he always came home. Bus to the corner, 3 blocks on foot, up the stairs because the elevator was slow, key in the door. His mother was still on her shift. The apartment was quiet. When he dropped his bag, drank a glass of water standing at the sink, and was about to sit at the kitchen table with his notebook when his phone buzzed. It was a number he didn't recognize. He ignored it. It buzzed again, then a third time, then a notification from an app he barely used. Someone had tagged him in something. Then another tag, then 5 more in the span of 30 seconds. He picked up the phone. The video was everywhere. Whoever had recorded it in the gym, and based on the angle, it had been someone sitting about midway up the left bleachers, had posted it with a caption that read, "Principal makes scholarship kid perform as punishment. Did not go how he planned." The clip was 2 minutes and 40 seconds. It started with Whitmore at the microphone, moved to Elijah walking across the gym floor, and ended just after the applause began. The framing was clean. You could see Elijah's hands on the keys. You could see the moment the room changed. By midnight it had 2 million views. By morning it had 9. The comments were a particular kind of overwhelming, the kind that comes when the internet collectively decides something is a story. People were angry at Whitmore. People were in awe of Elijah. Music teachers were posting reaction videos analyzing his technique. A former Juilliard student wrote a thread about the Chopin piece, identifying the specific nocturne, estimating the years of training it would take to play it at that level, and concluding that whoever this kid was, he had been seriously trained by someone who knew what they were doing. Elijah read about 30 comments before he put the phone face down on the table. He sat with his hands flat on the surface and looked at the wall for a while. Then he went to bed. The next morning at Hargrove was different in the specific way that things are different when everyone knows something has shifted, but no one is sure what comes next. Students who had never spoken to Elijah were suddenly speaking to him. Not all of them were insincere. Some were genuinely caught off guard by what they'd witnessed, and their attention came from a real place. But most of it had the texture of people wanting proximity to something that was now interesting, and Elijah had spent enough of his life understanding the difference between being seen and being useful to someone's narrative. He was polite. He was brief. He kept moving. In the main hallway before first period, a boy named Derek clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Bro, you're literally famous right now." Elijah said thanks and kept walking. A girl named Sophie asked if he was going to post more videos. Elijah said he didn't have a channel. She looked mildly disappointed, which confirmed something he'd already suspected about why she was asking. What he noticed more than the students, though, was the teachers. 3 of them said something to him before noon that they had never said in the 8 months he'd been here. Mr. Pearson told him he had real discipline. A history teacher whose name Elijah could never remember correctly stopped him in the hallway to say the performance was remarkable. A vice principal he'd only ever seen from a distance gave him a nod as he passed. 8 months of invisibility ended in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. He filed the feeling away for later. Principal Whitmore had called a staff meeting at 7 that morning before students arrived. The people who were in that meeting described it later in different ways, depending on how they felt about Whitmore, but they agreed on the essential shape of it. Whitmore had reframed the entire assembly as intentional. By the time the school's official social media account posted about it, and it posted before 10 o'clock, the language was careful and deliberate. Hargrove Academy is proud to spotlight one of our exceptional scholarship students whose extraordinary musical talent was on display yesterday morning in a special student showcase. There was a still image from the video. There was no mention of the original framing. There was no mention of punishment or tampering or accountability. There was certainly no mention of the laughter before the music started. It was a clean pivot. Whitmore had done what people in his position always do when control slips. He'd told a different story fast enough that some people would believe it was the only story. Ms. Alvarez read the post at her desk during her prep period. She set her phone down and pressed her fingers together until her knuckles were pale. She found Elijah at the end of the day, near the side exit that led to the bus stop. She didn't position herself there by accident. She'd waited. "Elijah." She fell into step beside him, which meant he either had to stop or have the conversation while walking. He stopped. She looked at him directly. She was not someone who eased into things. "Where did you learn to play like that?" "I taught myself," he said. The lie was flat and immediate. She recognized it as a lie the way a musician recognizes a wrong note, not because she could prove it, but because she knew what self-taught sounded like, and what she'd heard in that gym was not it. "You didn't teach yourself the Chopin," she said. Elijah looked at her. He said nothing. "The voicing," she said. "The way you shape the phrases in the middle passage. That's something someone showed you. Someone who understood the architecture of that piece from the inside." She paused. "I just want to understand." "It's not really something I talk about," he said. She accepted that. She didn't push further. "Okay, then. I want you to know that what happened in that assembly was not acceptable. What Whitmore did is over," Elijah said. Not harshly, just finally. She looked at him for a moment. All right." She nodded once. "But I'm here. If you ever want to talk about the music, just the music, I'm here." He picked up his bag and left. She stood at the side exit and watched him go, and the feeling she had was the complicated one she'd been carrying since the assembly, a mixture of admiration and guilt in proportions that didn't balance comfortably. Ethan Cole had been the school's musical centerpiece since 6th grade. He played violin and piano both, and he played them well. The kind of well that wins regional competitions and earns write-ups in the school newsletter and makes parents point at you during concerts and tell their children, that's what practice looks like. He was 15, 2 years ahead of Elijah, and his identity at Hargrove was so deeply fused with being the musical prodigy that he'd stopped thinking of it as one thing about himself and started thinking of it as the whole thing. He had been in the gym on Tuesday. He'd recorded it too, briefly, before lowering his phone. He spent 2 days processing what he'd witnessed, telling himself the angle was flattering, telling himself the acoustics in the gym made everything sound better, telling himself it was one piece, a party trick. It didn't mean anything. By Thursday, when the comments from actual music professionals were circulating online and people were openly calling Elijah the most talented student Hargrove had ever produced, Ethan had crossed from processing into something uglier. He started with rumors the way you start a small fire, carefully, with things that were just plausible enough to spread. He told 2 people that he'd heard the video was edited to enhance the audio quality. He mentioned to someone else that he'd seen a tutorial online of the same Chopin piece, and it wasn't actually that hard if you watched enough videos. He said casually to a group at lunch that he thought it was interesting nobody was talking about how Elijah had basically learned everything from YouTube and was being treated like a prodigy for it. The rumors didn't stick the way he'd hoped. The video was too clean, the response from actual musicians too credible. But they added a low-level friction to the attention Elijah was receiving, a faint question mark that Ethan had placed there deliberately, hoping it would grow. Elijah heard the rumors third-hand by Thursday afternoon. He filed them in the same category as most things at this school: noted, irrelevant, moved on. On Friday, the school received an email. It came through the main office address and was forwarded to Whitmore by the administrative assistant with a note that said simply, "You'll want to see this." The email was from the outreach coordinator at the Aldrich Conservatory, a music institute about 40 minutes outside the city, with a junior fellowship program for students between 12 and 16. They had seen the video. They were inquiring about Elijah Carter, specifically whether he was enrolled in any formal music training and whether the school would be open to facilitating a conversation. Whitmore read the email twice. Then he called the administrative assistant back and told her to hold any responses to outside inquiries about Elijah until further notice. Danielle Carter worked 12-hour shifts 3 days a week and spent the other 4 holding the rest of life together. The groceries, the bills, the small repairs the building super never got to, the phone calls to her mother in Atlanta, the laundry that always seemed to regenerate. She was 38, and she moved through her days with the efficiency of someone who had learned that time was not a resource to be enjoyed, but managed. She loved her son with a completeness that she wasn't always sure she expressed adequately, because expressing things required time, and time was the one thing that was always short. She paid attention to him in the specific way of parents who can't always be present. She read the silences. She noticed the way he carried himself when something was wrong versus when he was just tired. She watched his hands. She found the video Friday evening, sitting at the kitchen table after he'd gone to his room. She'd seen a notification someone had texted her, a coworker who'd sent it with 3 exclamation points, and the message, "Is this your Elijah?" She watched it. She watched it again. Then she sat at the table for a long time, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. She wasn't surprised by his ability. She had always known it, had heard him practicing through the wall of his room, had seen the notebook filled with music. He had understood enough of what his grandfather had poured into those early years to know it had taken root deeply. She was not surprised that he could play like that. What moved through her, sitting at the kitchen table, was something more specific. The image of her son walking across a gym floor toward a piano, alone, with 600 people waiting for him to fail, and choosing to sit down anyway. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. When he came out for water, she was still at the table. "You were going to tell me?" she said, not angry, just asking. He stopped. He looked at the phone on the table. Something moved across his face that was close to relief, the particular relief of a thing you've been holding alone finally being known. "I didn't want you to worry while you were working," he said. She nodded slowly. Come sit down." He sat across from her. "Tell me what happened," she said. "From the beginning." He did. He told her about the keyboard in room 114, the accusation, the office, Whitmore's face, the walk across the gym. He told it plainly, without dramatics, the way he always told things. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Did you know?" she asked. "That you could handle it?" He thought about this honestly. "I didn't know how they'd react. I just knew I could play." She looked at him across the table. "Your grandfather would have had things to say about that man." He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to the surface, but it was close. That night, after his mother had gone to bed, Elijah went to his room and stood in front of the keyboard. He opened the storage compartment built into the back of the Casio's base, a space his grandfather had built in himself years ago, adding a thin wooden panel over a small hollow, just large enough for papers and small objects. He had opened it before. He knew what was in it, but he opened it again now. The letter was there, single sheet, folded twice, written in his grandfather's handwriting, small, precise letters that leaned slightly to the left. "Eli, by the time you find this, I may not be around to explain it, so I'll say it here, where the music lives. People will try to decide your worth for you. Teachers, principals, audiences, critics, all of them will look at your hands before they look at your eyes, and they will measure what they see against what they expected, and the measurement will never be fair. Do not let their math become yours. You are not performing for them. You never were. You are continuing something longer than your life and longer than mine. Play like you know that. I love you, boy. Grandpa Ray Elijah folded the letter carefully and set it back. He sat on the bench. He pressed middle C again, held it, let it fade. Then he just sat in the quiet, the letter resting where it always rested, his grandfather's words settling in him the way they did each time. Not like new information, but like something that had always been true and just needed to be read again to stay true. The news about the Aldrich Conservatory's email did not stay in the main office. Nothing did, really. Schools had their own particular version of the way small towns work, or where information moved through the support staff, and the long-tenured teachers, and the parents who volunteered and ended up knowing more than anyone officially told them. By Monday of the following week, Ms. Alvarez had heard about it from the administrative assistant who handled scheduling, who'd seen the email before Whitmore locked it down. She went to Whitmore's office that morning during her prep period. She sat across from him and asked, directly, whether the school intended to respond to the conservatory's inquiry. Whitmore told her the school was evaluating all outside communications carefully, given the current level of media attention, and that decisions about student representation would be made at the appropriate administrative level. It was the kind of answer that meant no while being unsayable as no. Ms. Alvarez left his office knowing two things: that Whitmore was not going to do anything that gave Elijah more visibility unless he could control that visibility, and that she was going to have to decide how much of this she was willing to watch from the sidelines. He announced it in a Tuesday morning assembly, smaller than last week's, just the upper school, framed as an opportunity the school was proud to extend to an exceptional student. Elijah Carter would represent Hargrove Academy in the Regional Youth Music Competition, held in 3 weeks at the Hargrove Performing Arts Center downtown. The competition was district level, with judges from 3 accredited conservatories. The winner received a citation and a scholarship supplement. Whitmore presented it as recognition, as pride, as the school celebrating one of its own. Elijah sat in the bleachers and listened and understood immediately what it actually was. The competition was real. The opportunity in it was real. But the way Whitmore had packaged it was not generosity. It was management. By putting Elijah in a formal, high-stakes setting under the school's flag, Whitmore accomplished 3 things. He controlled the narrative around Elijah's talent by making himself part of it. He transferred accountability. If Elijah performed brilliantly, Hargrove took credit. If he struggled publicly, it was a student who didn't rise to the occasion. And he elevated the stakes around Elijah to a level designed to produce pressure rather than opportunity. It was elegant in its way. Elijah gave Whitmore credit for that. He didn't say any of this out loud. After the assembly, Ms. Alvarez found him in the hallway. "I didn't know he was going to announce that," she said. "I know," Elijah said. "The competition is legitimate. The judges are legitimate." She paused. "But the conditions he's setting up around it, I don't think this is what it's being presented as." "No," Elijah agreed. She looked at him carefully. "I'd like to work with you, formally, after school sessions, in the music room, with a real training structure." She said it plainly, not as an offer so much as a proposal between equals. Not because Whitmore announced anything, because what you have deserves to be developed properly. Elijah was quiet for a moment. He thought about the letter. He thought about what it had cost his grandfather to pour everything he had into teaching a child, knowing the industry would not make space for what he'd built. "Okay," he said. Ethan escalated the week Ms. Alvarez's sessions with Elijah began. He started with Elijah's practice schedule. The music room had a sign-up sheet for after-school use, a paper sheet on a clipboard hung outside the room's door, with 1-hour slots marked by student name. It was an honor system. Nobody supervised it. On Tuesday, Elijah arrived at the music room at 4 o'clock for a slot he'd signed up for the previous Friday. His name was gone. Someone had written over it, not crossed it out, but written a different student's name directly on top of it in ink darker than Elijah's pencil. That student was not present. The room was empty. He borrowed the room anyway, playing quietly for 30 minutes before the actual occupant, a girl who'd signed up for 5 o'clock, arrived, and he left. The next morning, he overheard someone telling another student that Elijah was thinking about dropping out of the competition, that it was too much pressure, that he'd said so to someone. He had said nothing of the kind to anyone. The rumor was specific enough to have required deliberate construction. He identified Ethan as the source by Friday through the pattern of where the information had originated. He didn't confront him. He noted it. He kept going. The sessions with Ms. Alvarez were different from anything Elijah had experienced since his grandfather. She didn't begin with pieces. She began with fundamentals, not because she doubted his technique, but because she wanted to understand exactly where his foundation was and what it had been built on. Or she gave him scales and asked him to play them not mechanically but with intention, to make the scale feel like something, not run through it. She asked him to play passages with his eyes closed and then describe what he'd heard. She gave him a short composition he'd never seen and asked him to play it twice, once exactly as written and once as he would play it if the notation didn't exist. He played it the second way, and she sat very still for a moment. "Who taught you that phrasing?" she asked. "My grandfather," he said, the first time he'd said it out loud to anyone at this school. She waited, not pushing, just making space. He told her a version of it, not everything, but the shape. Raymond Carter, who had played jazz professionally from his late 20s until his early 50s, who had made records that were reviewed seriously and then largely forgotten, who had ended up teaching, first formally, then privately, then just to his grandson in a small apartment with an old Casio keyboard and a patience that never seemed to reach its limit. "Is he still playing?" Ms. Alvarez asked. "He passed 2 years ago," Elijah said. She nodded. "I'm sorry." No performance around it, just the words. "He taught me the classical pieces because he said you had to know the architecture before you could take it apart," Elijah said. "He started me on Journey when I was 6, moved me to Chopin by 8. But what he really wanted me to hear was the jazz, the way a phrase could breathe if you let it, the way the emotion could sit in the pause before a note as much as in the note itself." Ms. Alvarez was writing nothing down. She was just listening. "He said the best musicians were the ones who could tell the truth through the music," Elijah said. He didn't mean literally, he meant honestly, that the audience could hear when you were hiding. She was quiet for a moment. What happened to his career? Elijah looked at the keys. He had a recording that was supposed to be released through a label in the early 80s, a full album. It was ready. He paused. The label's A&R director told him the sound was too sophisticated for what they thought black jazz artists should be doing. They wanted something more commercial, simpler. He refused to change it. They dropped him. A white musician recorded a version of one of his compositions 2 years later and was nominated for an award for it. He said it without heat. Just the facts, arranged plainly. Grandpa Ray never recorded professionally again. The music room was very quiet. He kept the compositions, though, Elijah said, in a notebook. He was working on one when he died. Never finished it. He paused. "I've been trying to figure out how to finish it." Ms. Alvarez set down the pencil she'd been holding. "Then that's what you play at the competition," she said. Danielle found Elijah at the keyboard late that Thursday night, later than he should have been awake on a school night, bent over a notebook covered in the same cramped musical notation she remembered seeing in his grandfather's hands. She stood in the doorway for a while without speaking. Then she said, "You should sleep." "I know," he said. He didn't stop writing. She came and sat on the edge of his bed, the way she used to when he was small. "How's it going with Ms. Alvarez?" Good, he said. She listens different than most teachers. She listens to what you're doing, not to what she expected you to do. Danielle nodded. She looked at the notation. That's his, she said softly. Not a question. Yeah. She was quiet a moment. He was working on it for a long time. I remember he called it the piece that wouldn't let him alone. Elijah looked up from the notebook. He said some pieces were like that, she said. Like they had their own timeline. They weren't finished when the composer was ready. They were finished when the piece was ready. She paused. I think he knew he wasn't going to get to finish it. I think he left it for you. Elijah looked back at the notation. She stood up. She put her hand briefly on the back of his head. A small gesture, quick and practiced. Don't stay up too late. I won't, he said, which was what he always said. She went back to her room. He kept writing. The call came on a Friday afternoon, during the window when Whitmore was typically in his office for administrative review. He had placed it himself, using the direct line for judge communications that was printed on the competition's official materials. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. He described himself as Hargrove's principal, expressed his enthusiasm for the competition, and mentioned, conversationally, tangentially, carefully, that Elijah Carter was a scholarship student whose preparation had been somewhat unconventional, whose formal training background was not entirely clear, and who could be a bit unpredictable under pressure. He framed it as context. He framed it as transparency. He did not raise his voice. He did not make explicit requests. He simply placed a set of impressions into the minds of people who would be sitting at a judging table in 2 weeks. It was not something that could be proven. That was the point. That same Friday afternoon, Elijah walked into the music room and sat at the upright piano Miss Alvarez had reserved for him. The room was empty. The light came in flat and gray from the windows along the far wall. He opened his grandfather's notebook to the last page with notation on it. The piece stopped at the 43rd measure. After that, empty staves, the lines drawn, the space ready, the music not there yet. He read through the 43 measures slowly, not playing yet, just hearing it in his mind. Then he set his hands on the keys. He played what existed. He played it the way his grandfather had played everything, with care and intention and the particular kind of honesty that doesn't announce itself. Then he reached the 43rd measure, and instead of stopping, he kept going. What came next was imperfect, searching. Some of it landed in the wrong place, and he course-corrected and tried again. But it was real. It was his. And underneath it, if you listened for it, you could hear something of Raymond Carter in the lines. The way the left hand moved, the space left for silence, the sense that the music was being discovered rather than performed. He played for an hour. He wrote down what he found. When he finally stopped, the light in the room had gone from gray to almost nothing. He sat in the near dark for a moment. Then he closed the notebook. But he stood up from the bench with the particular straightness of someone who has decided something without fully knowing they were deciding it. Whatever Whitmore had set in motion, the competition, the framing, the pressure, the quiet sabotage, it was real. It was coming. And it was not designed for Elijah to succeed inside it. He knew that. He was going anyway. He was going to play his grandfather's music in front of people who had no idea what they were about to hear. He was going to finish what Raymond Carter started, and no amount of positioning from Whitmore, no manufactured rumors from Ethan, no stacked deck or tilted table was going to change what happened when his hands found the keys. He had learned that much from Tuesday. He picked up his bag. He turned off the light. He walked out. The sessions with Ms. Alvarez ran Monday through Thursday, 4 to 5:30, in the music room at the end of the East Corridor. She had cleared the schedule herself, moved a sophomore ensemble to Wednesday mornings, and rearranged her own planning periods to protect the time. She didn't tell Whitmore she'd done it. She just did it. The training was not what Elijah had expected, which was part of what made it work. He had expected drills, repetition, the kind of structured preparation that competitions demanded. Clean technique, reliable execution, nothing that could go wrong. Instead, Ms. Alvarez spent the first session just listening to him play through the grandfather's composition, all 43 existing measures, without stopping him or writing anything down. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment. "You're protecting it," she said. He looked at her. "When you play it," she said, "you're holding it carefully, like it might break. That's not what it needs." He didn't respond immediately. He thought about it. "Play it like he already finished it," she said. "Like it's complete. Like it was always going to end where you end it. The music has to believe it, or the audience won't." He turned back to the keys and played it again. Something shifted in the second pass, a quality of commitment that hadn't been there before, a willingness to land fully on notes he'd been approaching tentatively. Ms. Alvarez sat back in her chair. "There," she said quietly. "That's it." They worked from that principle outward, not perfecting the piece so much as finding the confidence inside it. She pushed him on the improvised section, the part past measure 43, that was fully his. She asked him to play it differently each session, faster, slower, with more space, with less. She wanted him to understand the material so deeply that no version of it could surprise him. He came in every day. He stayed past 5:30 most nights. The school was still divided, and Ethan was still the quietest architect of that division. He had moved past rumors by the second week of training. The dropout story hadn't held, so he shifted to something more structural, working the social geography of the school in a way that cost Elijah not facts but proximity. He positioned himself near the students who'd been warming to Elijah and redirected their attention subtly, reframing Elijah's quietness as arrogance, his focus as dismissiveness. He doesn't really want friends here. He's just using the school for exposure. It was effective in the specific way that social pressure on 13-year-olds is always effective, not decisive, but draining. Students who'd been friendly to Elijah in the first week began to drift back toward the safer orbit of not being involved. Elijah noticed. He said nothing. What he couldn't ignore was what happened on the Thursday before the competition. He arrived at the music room at 4 and found the door locked. Not the regular lock, the secondary bolt that required a facilities key, not Ms. Alvarez's standard room key. A handwritten note on the door from the facilities office stated the room had been booked for a maintenance inspection, 4 to 6. There was no maintenance inspection. The room was dark and empty when he looked through the small window in the door. He went to find Ms. Alvarez. She was in the staff room, reading, and she stood up the moment she saw his face. "The room's locked," he said. She went immediately to the facilities office. The clerk told her the booking had come through the standard system, a request entered online using the staff portal. She asked who had filed it. The clerk checked. The name on the file was a substitute teacher who hadn't been in the building in 3 weeks. Ms. Alvarez came back and told Elijah what she'd found. They looked at each other with the shared understanding of people who recognize a pattern. "We'll use my classroom," she said. It had an old upright in the corner, one with a key that stuck in the upper register. They worked for 2 hours anyway. When Elijah left at 6:15, he was tired in a way that went past the muscles, a bone-level tiredness that comes from performing against resistance for long enough that resistance starts to feel like the default condition. He stood outside in the cold for a moment before heading to the bus stop. He thought about quitting. Not stopping the music, never that, but the competition. The whole machinery of it. He could step back. Tell Whitmore something had come up. Remove himself from the performance and the exposure and the deliberate friction that surrounded it. He stood there long enough to really consider it. Then he thought about measure 44. The first note passed where his grandfather had stopped, the moment the piece became partly his. He thought about what it had felt like to play it all the way through for the first time. The feeling not of performance, but of continuation, of something being carried forward by hands that had been shaped for exactly this. He picked up his bag and walked to the bus stop. That night he found the cassette tape. He'd known it was there. It lived in the same compartment as the letter, underneath a folded piece of cloth his grandfather had placed there himself. A standard cassette, the plastic cracked along one edge, the label written in the same left-leaning hand as the letter. Session, March 1987. He didn't have a cassette player. He'd known that too. But that week, after a session where Ms. Alvarez had mentioned offhand that the school's music archive still had working playback equipment, he'd borrowed a small handheld player from the cabinet in the back of her classroom. He pressed play. The recording opened with the ambient sound of a room, a radiator somewhere, traffic outside, a chair scraping. Then the piano began. It was his grandfather. Unmistakably. Not the version of his grandfather that Elijah had known in his last years. Quieter, slower, working around a stiffness in his right hand that he never complained about. This was Raymond Carter in the fullness of it, at whatever age he'd been in 1987, playing with a fluency and an emotional depth that hit Elijah somewhere below the sternum. The piece on the tape was not the unfinished composition. It was something else, an improvisation, raw and unrepeatable, the kind of playing that happens when no one is watching and the musician is talking to themselves. It moved from a blues structure into something more open, then into passages that had the formal clarity of composed music, even though they weren't. It was imperfect in the way real things are imperfect, a missed note in the third minute, a phrase that didn't quite resolve before the music moved on, and it was more alive because of that. Elijah listened to the whole thing. 12 minutes. Then he sat in the quiet. He understood something now that he hadn't quite understood before, not intellectually, he'd always known it, but in the deeper way that things move from knowledge into the body. His grandfather hadn't played for the industry, hadn't played for the label that dropped him, or the critics who forgot him, or the musician who stole his composition. He had played because the music was real and because honesty was the only way to meet it. The imperfection on the tape wasn't failure. It was evidence of someone telling the truth. That was what Elijah needed to take into the competition, not the perfect performance, the honest one. He set the tape player down. He sat at his keyboard. It was past 11. Too late to play with any real volume, so he pressed the keys softly, barely making sound, running through his grandfather's piece with a gentleness that wasn't restraint so much as intimacy. Just him and the music in the dark, no audience, no stakes. Somewhere in the middle of the improvised section, he realized he was smiling, not performing it, not deciding to. Just the expression that appeared when something true was happening, and the body recognized it before the mind caught up. He kept playing. The Hargrove Performing Arts Center downtown had the particular quality of spaces designed to make everything inside them feel significant. High ceilings, warm light falling in columns from fixtures above the stage. Rows of seating that curved slightly inward, wrapping the audience around the performance like cupped hands. It smelled like wood polish and old curtain fabric and the particular coolness of a room that took climate control seriously. Students from 11 schools had come. They moved through the lobby with instruments cases and the controlled nervousness of people who had been preparing for weeks and were now inside the actual day of it. Elijah arrived with Ms. Alvarez and 2 other Hargrove students who were competing in separate categories. He carried nothing, no instrument, no, just himself and the notebook with his grandfather's composition, which he'd been carrying everywhere for 10 days. He didn't need to look at it anymore. He knew the piece, but he brought it the way you bring a photograph, not for reference, but for company. The backstage area was organized and slightly chaotic, the way backstage always is. Students rehearsed in corners. Teachers hovered. A competition official with a clipboard moved through the space calling names for warm-up slots. Whitmore arrived 20 minutes after they did. He moved through the backstage space with the particular authority of a man in his institutional context, nodding to other principals, exchanging brief handshakes, wearing the school's confidence the way a blazer is worn. He spotted Elijah near the warm-up piano and crossed to him. Elijah. He said it the way you say someone's name when you want to establish a room's worth of distance inside 2 syllables. I want a word. Ms. Alvarez, who was standing close enough to hear, stayed exactly where she was. Whitmore positioned himself so that his back was partially toward her. Today is an important day for this school, he said. His voice was low, measured, carrying that particular tone of concern that isn't concern. I know you've been working hard. I want to make sure you're ready. Competitions like this, the judges have high expectations. They're looking for discipline, precision, students who represent their schools with the kind of maturity that reflects serious training. A pause. I hope today isn't going to be another situation where things go a different direction than planned. The implication was clean and deliberate. Don't do what you did in the gym. Play what they expect. Don't embarrass this school. Don't embarrass me. Elijah looked at him steadily. He said nothing. Whitmore held eye contact for a moment, then nodded once, the nod of someone who has said what he came to say, and moved back toward the other administrators. Ms. Alvarez stepped up beside Elijah. She didn't comment on what she'd heard. She just looked at him directly and said, "Play your truth, not his version of it." Elijah nodded. He found Ethan in the corridor outside the warm-up room 40 minutes before the competition began. Ethan was sitting against the wall, violin case across his knees. Now, not doing anything, just sitting with the expression of someone whose mind is somewhere unpleasant. He looked up when Elijah approached, and something moved across his face that wasn't quite defensiveness, but was adjacent to it. Elijah didn't have a speech prepared. He hadn't planned to say anything, but he sat down beside him, not confrontationally, just sat, and after a moment said, "You've been working against me for 2 weeks." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yeah, you do," Elijah said, quietly, without heat. "The practice slot, the rumors, the maintenance booking." He paused. "I'm not here to argue about it. I just want to understand why." Ethan said nothing for a long moment. His hands moved on the violin case, adjusting a clasp that didn't need adjusting. "I've been the best musician in that school since I was 12, he said finally. His voice came out lower than he'd probably intended, tighter. "Every assembly, every concert, every newsletter, my parents have told every person they know, my whole—" He stopped, started again. "And then you sit down at a piano you've never touched in front of the entire school, and everybody forgets I exist." Elijah let that sit. "You've been playing your whole life, too," he said. "Not like that." "You don't know how you play," Elijah said. "Because you've been playing for the result, for the newsletter. You don't know what you sound like when nobody's watching." Ethan looked at him. "That's the only version that matters," Elijah said. He stood up. "Play for you today. See what happens." He walked back toward the warm-up room. He didn't look back. Behind him, Ethan sat with the violin case across his knees and the particular expression of someone who has just been handed something they needed but hadn't expected to receive. The competition ran in order of school assignment. Hargrove was 7th. Elijah sat in the wings and listened to 6 other students perform, some technically clean, some emotionally present, one who was both. The judges sat at a long table below the stage, 3 of them, making notes without showing their faces much. He thought about Whitmore's call. He had no evidence of it. Ms. Alvarez had told him she suspected it had happened based on the tightness of the initial judge's brief when schools were announced. He couldn't prove it. It didn't matter. Whatever impressions Whitmore had planted, they were already planted. The only thing he could do about them was play. His name was called. He walked onto the stage. The lights were warmer from up here than from the seats, and they narrowed the visible world. The audience was there, present but indistinct, the way an ocean is present beyond a shoreline without being fully seeable. The piano sat at center stage, a Steinway grand, lid fully open, black finish catching the light. He sat down. He adjusted the bench slightly. Habit. He set his hands on his lap for a moment, not on the keys, just breathing, letting the room exist around him without trying to manage it. Then he set his hands on the keys and began. He opened with the classical movement, the structured, composed first half of the piece, the foundation his grandfather had built in those 43 measures. It was precise. It was controlled. The kind of playing that makes judges sit straight because it is unmistakably the product of serious, sustained training. The harmonic structure moved with intention, the dynamics shaped by more than mechanics, by understanding. He could feel the room settling, that early audience adjustment where people stop arranging themselves and start actually listening. The judges were writing. He played through the end of the composed section, arrived at measure 43. And then, instead of stopping, instead of bowing and walking off as the structure demanded, he kept going. The shift was not abrupt. It was the way a river changes character. Same water, different terrain, a new quality of movement emerging from the same source. The classical precision opened into something more spacious. A jazz phrasing entered the left hand. The right hand found a melodic line that was his grandfather's voice and his own at once, the call and response structure Raymond Carter had used in the 1987 recording, transformed by time and grief and the specific understanding of a boy who had grown up in the echo of it. The judges stopped writing. One of them, a woman in the center, gray-haired, who had been the most expressionless of the three, set her pen down on the table and leaned forward slightly. In the second row of seating, Danielle Carter pressed her hand to her mouth. She had come without telling Elijah she would be there. Ms. Alvarez had called her. She sat in the dark of the audience and listened to her son play her father's music and felt something she didn't have a word for. Grief and pride so close together, they were nearly the same emotion. And the music moved through its improvised section with the quality the tape had given him. Not perfect, not cautious, but honest. A phrase would reach and not quite arrive, and then find its way from a different direction. The imperfection was structural. It was how the piece breathed. In the wings, Ms. Alvarez stood with her arms folded and her chin slightly raised, watching. From the far side of the backstage corridor, Whitmore watched through a monitor feed. His face was still. Whatever he had hoped or expected or arranged, it was not happening. The room was not responding with the polite, measured appreciation of judges evaluating technical merit. It was responding with the stillness of people who have encountered something they weren't prepared for. Elijah brought the piece toward its end, a resolution that he had worked out over the last 10 days, a landing that honored both the classical structure and the jazz roots that felt like an answer to the question the opening had asked. The final chord rang out and he held it, let the sustain carry it into the room until it faded fully. Silence. Then the center judge began to applaud. Standing, then the judge to her left, then the third, then the audience rising row by row, not simultaneously, not on cue, but with the momentum of something genuine moving outward from the stage. Elijah sat at the piano for a moment before standing. He looked out at the audience, indistinct still, shapes in warm light, and found his mother without being able to see her face clearly. He knew she was there. He could feel the specific weight of it. He stood. He turned toward the judge's table and gave the formal acknowledgement the competition required, a brief, composed bow. Then he walked off the stage. Ms. Alvarez was waiting in the wings. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder. Nothing more, no words, just that. He kept walking. Behind him, the applause continued. In the monitor room, Whitmore stood very still. He had orchestrated this day with the precision of someone who managed outcomes for a living. He had made calls, shifted framing, applied pressure. He had tried to ensure that whatever happened in this building reflected the version of events that served him. And now he stood watching the monitor, watching the audience still on their feet, watching the judges conferring with something on their faces that was not evaluation, but response. And he understood. He, with a clarity that arrived too late to be useful, that he had made a serious error. Not in this room. The error had been made weeks ago in an assembly when he had walked a 13-year-old boy across a gym floor thinking he was making a point about authority. He had made a point, just not the one he'd intended. He turned away from the monitor. He walked toward the exit. And for the first time at a school event in 11 years, Harold Whitmore left a room without working it, without handshakes, without positioning, without the slow, patient management of how things looked. He just left. The results were announced 40 minutes after the last performer left the stage. Elijah was sitting in the third row of the audience with Ms. Alvarez to his left and his mother to his right. Danielle had found him in the lobby after the performance. And the hug she'd given him was the kind that doesn't require words and doesn't rush itself. She'd held on for a moment longer than necessary, and he'd let her, which was its own kind of communication between people who didn't always have time for the long version of things. The competition director, a thin man with reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, took the microphone at the front of the stage and worked through the category placements in ascending order. Third, second, first, and the room responded to each name with the calibrated applause of an audience that is waiting for the one they care about. When he reached the piano division, the center judge, the woman who had set her pen down during Elijah's performance, stood briefly and said that before the placement was announced, the judges wanted to recognize something outside the standard structure. She said it simply, without ceremony. The panel had agreed unanimously to award a special citation for originality and emotional authenticity in performance. This was not a category in the competition's regular framework. It was the kind of recognition that panels extend when something happens that the rubric wasn't designed to hold. She said Elijah Carter's name. The room responded before she finished the sentence. Elijah sat in the third row and received it with the same stillness he brought to most things. Not indifference, not performance, just the steadiness of someone who has already spent the emotion on what mattered and is now present for what follows. His mother's hand found his arm and held it briefly. Ms. Alvarez looked straight ahead with the expression of someone containing something large in a small space. He was also announced as first place in the piano division. The woman from the Aldrich Conservatory found him in the lobby while the post-competition reception was still organizing itself, before the refreshment table had been fully set up, while people were still moving from the auditorium in clusters. She was in her mid-50s, quietly dressed, with the particular directness of someone who had spent a career saying important things to people who weren't always ready to hear them. She introduced herself as Margaret Oakes, head of junior program outreach at the Aldrich Conservatory. She said she'd seen the viral video 3 weeks ago and that the school had reached out to Hargrove following it. She said the response they'd received had been, she paused carefully, limited. She said she was glad she had decided to come in person today. She told Elijah that the conservatory's junior fellowship program accepted 6 students per year, offered full training, performance opportunities, and a scholarship that covered tuition and materials. She said she'd brought an information packet, which she handed him, and that she was not in the habit of making commitments in a lobby before a student's parents had reviewed anything. But she wanted him to know that the conversation, if he wanted to have it, was waiting for him whenever he was ready. Elijah thanked her. He held the packet at his side and looked at her directly. "Did you know my grandfather?" he asked. "Raymond Carter." Margaret Oakes looked at him for a moment. And something shifted in her expression, not surprise exactly, but recognition of a name that carried weight. "I knew his work," she said carefully. "I came to music professionally in the late 80s. His recordings were discussed among people who paid attention. He should have had a much larger audience." She paused. "Is he the one who trained you?" "Yes," Elijah said. She nodded slowly. "Then this makes more sense than it already did." She held out her hand, and he shook it. "Talk to your mother. Take your time. We'll be in touch." Rachel Green's article published the following Tuesday morning. She had been working on it for 3 weeks, since before the competition, gathering records, filing information requests. He's speaking with former students and current staff members who were willing to go on record and others who were not. The piece ran in the city's main digital newspaper under the headline, "A Pattern of Public Humiliation: How One Principal Used Student Exposure as Discipline." Elijah's story was the opening, but it was not the only story. There were 4 others. A girl named Brianna, now 17, who had been made to stand before an assembly 3 years earlier and apologize publicly for a plagiarism accusation that had later been determined to be a grading error. She had never received a formal apology. A boy named Marcus, now in high school across the city, who had been pulled out of a classroom in 8th grade and publicly questioned in front of a parent group about an allegation that turned out to involve a different student entirely. 2 others whose accounts had enough similarities in structure: the use of assembly settings, the public framing as correction, the absence of due process, that the pattern was clear even without names. Rachel had also obtained records through a Freedom of Information request showing that 3 formal complaints had been filed against Whitmore over the past 7 years. All 3 had been reviewed internally. None had resulted in documented action. The article was careful and specific. It did not use words like monster or corrupt. It laid out what had happened and let the accumulation of it speak. By noon, it had been shared widely enough that the school board's communications office had sent a statement acknowledging the reports and confirming that a review was being initiated. By 3 o'clock, the 2 local television stations had picked up the story. By the following morning, it was regional news. Within days, the voices multiplied. They came forward in the way that people come forward when they see someone else say the thing they'd been holding privately, not all at once, but steadily, each one making the next slightly easier. Former students who had graduated years ago, parents who had raised concerns informally and been managed rather than heard. A teacher who had left Hargrove 4 years earlier and who had written a letter of concern to the district that had been, as far as she knew, filed and forgotten. The school board called an emergency session on Friday of that week. Elijah was not present at the meeting. Neither was his mother. By choice, she had reviewed the article with the same careful attention she gave medical documentation, and she had said, simply, "They'll handle it, or they won't. Either way, you keep going." What she meant by that was clear enough. What happened in the meeting was reported afterward by board members through official channels and unofficially by people who had been in the building. Whitmore was questioned formally by 3 board members. He presented his account of the assembly. The word he used was showcase, the same word that had appeared in the school's social media post, and argued that the Rachel Green article represented a selective reading of events by people who had misunderstood the educational philosophy behind public accountability. He was articulate. He was composed. He had the practiced ease of someone who had navigated institutional reviews before, but he had not prepared for Ethan. Ethan Cole had requested to address the board. He was 15 years old, carried his own weight in the school's social hierarchy, and had nothing obviously to gain from what he was about to do. Those facts together gave his words a credibility that was difficult to dismiss. He stood in front of the board and said that he had been present at the original assembly. He said that the word showcase was not the word anyone in that room would have used to describe what they saw before Elijah began to play. He described the framing, the laughter, the phones. He described the atmosphere that Whitmore had created, not as isolated behavior, but as a climate. He said that the pressure to perform publicly, to be corrected publicly, to be evaluated publicly, regardless of whether that evaluation was fair, had been part of how the school functioned. That students had learned to perform their compliance the same way they'd learned to perform everything else, for an audience that Whitmore was always, in every setting, the center of. Then he said, "I also need to tell you that I made things harder for Elijah Carter during his competition preparation. I canceled his practice reservations. I spread rumors. I am saying that here because I was doing what that school taught me to do. I was trying to protect my position by eliminating a threat. That's not something I learned at home. That's something I learned at Hargrove." The room after he finished had the particular quality of a space in which something true has just been said, and the people in it are deciding what to do with it. Ms. Alvarez testified in writing and in person. Her written statement covered what she had witnessed the morning of the original assembly, the framing, the mocking introduction, the laughter she had not stopped, and what she had done afterward, which was not enough, and what she wished she had done instead, which she described without self-protection or extenuation. She did not excuse her silence by listing the professional risks she'd been weighing. She named them and said they had not been a good enough reason. In person, she addressed Whitmore directly, briefly, without drama. She said she had worked in this school for 6 years, and that in those 6 years she had watched students absorb the message that their value was contingent on how they appeared to authority, that mistakes were opportunities for display rather than correction, that the institution's reputation mattered more than the individual's dignity. She said she had not said this loudly enough, soon enough, to anyone in a position to act on it. She said she was saying it now. Whitmore, sitting across the table, looked at her with the expression of a man who has run out of the right vocabulary for the situation and is reaching for words that no longer fit. When it was his turn to respond to the testimony, he said he respected Ms. Alvarez's perspective, but believed the characterization was unfair. He said that Hargrove's outcomes spoke for themselves. He said that difficult decisions in a school leadership role were frequently misunderstood in hindsight. The board chair thanked him for his comments. The deliberation did not take long. By late afternoon, the board had voted to place Whitmore on administrative leave pending the outcome of a formal investigation. His access to school premises and systems was suspended immediately. He was informed of this in a meeting with the board chair and a district representative, with a union liaison present, as procedure required. He left the building at 5:40 on a Friday. Students had gone home hours earlier. The hallways were empty. His footsteps on the polished marble floor were the only sound. There was no assembly, no microphone, no audience arranged to witness the lesson. On just the building that had run according to his understanding of how things should work, quietly, firmly, with consequences for those who stepped outside the accepted shape of things. The irony was not subtle. He had believed in public accountability. He had built systems around it. He had used the watching eyes of 600 students as an instrument of control. Now, in an empty building with no one watching, he walked out. The silence he left behind was exactly the kind he had once wielded. He did not appear to notice. 3 weeks passed before things at Hargrove began to feel different in a way that was structural rather than just atmospheric. The interim principal, a woman named Dr. Sandra Lee, brought in from the district office, held a full school assembly on her 3rd day. She did not use it to correct anyone. She used it to introduce herself and to ask the students, directly and without performance, what they thought the school needed to do better. She wrote their answers on a whiteboard herself in her own handwriting, which someone later photographed and which circulated among the parent community as evidence of something real shifting. The public punishment policy was formally discontinued. A student advocacy committee was established with elected representatives from each grade. The practice room sign-up system was moved to a digital platform with administrator oversight and an audit log. A practical change that was also a statement about accountability, moving in a direction it hadn't before. Ms. Alvarez was appointed interim head of the music department while a formal search was conducted. She accepted with a condition that the department's programming be reviewed for equity in how resources, performance opportunities, and recognition were distributed across students. Dr. Lee agreed without negotiation. Elijah watched all of this from the same back row seat he'd occupied since September. He watched it without cynicism. He could see that the changes were real, but without full trust either, which was not the same as despair. It was more like the patience of someone who understood that institutions change slowly, and that the only honest thing was to watch and see. He was quieter than ever in some ways, and freer than ever in others. He accepted the Aldrich Conservatory Fellowship 2 weeks after the competition, or after 3 conversations between his mother and Margaret Oakes and 1 visit to the campus, a set of connected buildings on the edge of a residential neighborhood, smaller than he'd imagined, with practice rooms that had good light and hallways that smelled like rosin and sheet music. He had walked through it and felt something he didn't have a specific word for. Rightness, maybe. The sense of a space that was shaped for what he did rather than shaped for everything else, and having him try to fit inside it. He would finish the school year at Hargrove, then transition to the conservatory in the fall. He was 13, and his life was about to change in the way that lives change when someone finally puts you in the right room. He was not overwhelmed by this. He was, in the most private part of himself, deeply glad. What the final performance at Hargrove was Ms. Alvarez's idea, proposed carefully, accepted by Elijah after a few days of thinking about it. Not a competition, not a showcase, not an assembly where attendance was mandatory and the structure of the thing implied hierarchy. Just an invitation, a notice posted on the school's bulletin boards and sent through the student email system. Elijah Carter will perform in the main hall Friday at 4 o'clock. All are welcome. No dress code, no program, no assigned seating. By 3:50 on Friday afternoon, the main hall was full. Students sat on the floor when the chairs filled. Teachers stood along the walls. Dr. Lee was there, near the back. Parents who had driven from across the district were there. Some who had read the article, some who had watched the viral video weeks ago, and some who had simply heard through other parents that something worth seeing was going to happen. Danielle Carter sat in the front row, which Ms. Alvarez had quietly reserved. She was in her scrubs. She had come directly from a shift that had ended an hour earlier, had not gone home to change. She sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and her face arranged in the expression of a woman who has not slept quite enough for quite a long time, and who is, nonetheless, completely present. The piano was the same upright from the gym, moved here deliberately at Elijah's request. Not the Steinway Grand from the competition, not a better instrument. The same one from the day of the assembly, with its slightly stiff action and its particular tone, warm in the middle register and a touch bright at the top. Elijah walked in from the side door. He was wearing what he wore most days: dark pants, the school blazer, the ordinary clothes of a 13-year-old on a school day. He had not dressed up for this. That, too, was deliberate. He sat down on the bench. The room was already quiet. Not the held breath quiet of people waiting to be impressed. The settled quiet of a room that has decided, collectively and without being asked, to be present for something. He adjusted the bench. He set his hands on his lap. He looked at the keys for a moment, not hesitating, just arriving. Being here. Then he began. He opened with something none of them had heard him play before, a short, simple piece, one his grandfather had written for him when he was 6 years old. Not technically demanding, intentionally not. How it was the kind of music a patient teacher writes for a child's hands, shaped around what small fingers can do, full of space and gentleness. Elijah had not played it publicly before. He had barely played it since he was small. He played it now, in this room, in front of all these people, the way a person returns to the first language they learned, not to show that they speak it, but because it is the truest version of what they want to say. The room received it in silence. Then he moved into the grandfather's composition. The full piece now, the 43 measures Raymond Carter had written and the measures Elijah had completed, all of it together, a single continuous arc from what had been given to him to what he had made from it. He played the classical structure with the precision that came from years of learning it properly, and the improvised section with the honesty that came from the cassette tape, from the late-night sessions, from finally understanding that truth in music was not the absence of imperfection, but the presence of something real underneath it all. He played through the passage where his grandfather had stopped. He crossed measure 43 and kept going, and the music opened the way it had at the competition, but differently here, in this smaller room with this older piano, more intimate, more particular. The acoustic of the space changed what it sounded like. The Yamaha upright gave it a warmth the Steinway hadn't, a roughness at the edges that made it feel handmade rather than achieved. More like the recording, more like his grandfather. I'm sitting in a room in 1987 with a radiator making noise and traffic outside the window, playing for the truth of it. The room held very still. In the front row, Danielle had her eyes closed. She was not crying, though she had been earlier and might again. She was listening. Listening the way she'd listened to her father play when she was young, in the particular way of people who receive music not as spectators, but as participants, as people to whom it is being said. Ms. Alvarez, standing at the side of the room, watched Elijah's hands move and thought about 6 years of staying quiet in situations that had required a different choice. She thought about the assembly, about the look on his face when he walked across the gym floor. She thought about what it had taken for someone that young, that alone in that moment, to sit down at the piano and not give them what they wanted. She would not make the same choices again. She was sure of that in the way you are sure of things that have cost you something to learn. Ethan sat midway back in the crowd, his violin case at his feet. He had come because he had wanted to, not from obligation, not from the social calculation that had governed so many of his choices in this school. He listened to Elijah play and felt for the first time in a long time something uncomplicated, admiration, clean, direct, unthreatened. He had played in a small ensemble last week, informally, in a practice room after school with 2 other students who'd asked if he wanted to join them. He had played without thinking about how it looked or what it meant for his position at the school. He had played and found, somewhere in the middle of it, that he still loved the instrument. He had nearly forgotten that. The grandfather's composition moved toward its ending. Elijah brought it down slowly, not rushing the resolution, letting each phrase complete itself before the next one began, the way you close a long conversation when you want to honor what was said rather than just finish it. The final chord was simple. He held it until the sustain faded completely. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after. Then the applause began, and it came the way real applause comes, not from the hands, but from somewhere deeper. The sound of people responding to something that got past their usual, careful management of themselves. Elijah sat at the bench for a moment. He looked out at the room, the students on the floor, the teachers along the walls. His mother in the front row. He stood. He turned toward the room and gave a small, unhurried bow. Not the competition bow, something more personal than that. The acknowledgement of one person to many, offered plainly. Danielle stood. She crossed the small space between the front row and the piano and put her arms around him, and he let her, leaning into it slightly, the way he had in the lobby after the competition, with the complete absence of self-consciousness that is only possible between people who know each other past the surface of things. She held on. Then, close to his ear, barely above a whisper, he would have been so proud. Elijah was quiet for a moment. The room was still applauding around them, though distantly now the way sounds recede when something immediate is happening. "I think he already was," he said softly. Danielle pulled back just enough to look at her son's face. She pressed her hand once to the side of his face, the gesture of someone saying something that has no word, and then let go. Months later, on a Tuesday morning in September, Elijah Carter walked into the Aldrich Conservatory for his first full day of the fellowship program. He was still quiet, still the kind of person who sat in the back of a room and observed before speaking, who carried a notebook full of music instead of conversation, who moved through spaces without announcing himself. These things had not changed. They were not problems to be solved. He found his assigned practice room, small, clean, good light from a north-facing window, a Yamaha upright against the wall that was newer than his grandfather's keyboard and older than the Steinway, but had a tone he liked immediately. He set his bag down. He opened his notebook to the page where the grandfather's composition lived. All of it now, complete, his own handwriting filling in the measures past 43 in the pencil that leaned slightly left the way his grandfather's had, which he'd never noticed before, and which he noticed now, with a feeling he didn't try to name. He sat at the bench. He set his hands on the keys. He was not proving anything. There was no assembly, no principal with a microphone, no room full of people who had gathered to watch him fail. There was no viral video, no article, no board meeting, no career that needed to be reclaimed or record that needed to be set straight. There was a room with good light and a piano and a notebook full of music. He began to play, and the music that came was the truest thing he knew how to make. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Because it carried something forward. Because somewhere in the notes and the silence between them, Raymond Carter was still teaching, and Elijah was still learning, and the distance between them had become something the music could cross. They tried to use his hands to break him. But when his fingers touched the keys, they didn't just hear music, they heard the truth. When the world tries to use your silence against you, does it change what you carry inside, or only who finally gets to hear it? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe. We have more stories that stay with you long after they end.